Hello, I'm Congressman Ritchie, and I proudly represent New York's 15th Congressional District in the Bronx. Welcome to the first episode of my new web series, Bronx Tales. As a lifelong Bronx boy myself, I know firsthand how many unsung heroes live throughout our borough, working every day to improve the lives of Bronxites and build a better tomorrow. So that's why I'm starting Bronx Tales, a series in which I will interview the very best of the Bronx and attempt to get to the heart of what our borough represents. I hope you enjoy my first interview today with the lovely Dr. Karen Baptiste, the founder of Preschool to Prison, LLC. Hello, I'm Congressman Ritchie, and I have the high honor of representing the Bronx. And I'm proud to be joined by one of the unsung heroes of the Bronx, Dr. Karen Baptiste. Welcome to Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us your Bronx tale.
Whew. I mean, proud Bronx. I was a teacher in the Bronx, a special education teacher. Yeah. I was a teacher's assistant, referred to as a paraprofessional. I was a coach. I became an administrator, and I've lived in the Bronx my whole life. And I've seen so many wonderful things happening across the Bronx. I had a very unique experience growing up in the Bronx, and I carry that with me every day, and I'm proud of those experiences because it shaped who I am.
You know, my mother taught me that the most important lesson in life is to never forget who you are.
Yes.
And never forget where you came from. And I feel like you embody that principle powerfully.
Yes.
Like, what in your lived experience motivated you to become an educator committed to ending the preschool to prison pipeline?
Yeah, going to school, I didn't think I would actually become an educator. It wasn't a thought. Yeah. School wasn't always the most desirable place for me. I didn't have a bad experience in school, but it wasn't a place that made me feel like I should come back and be an educator. But through that process, I met people along that journey who encouraged me to go to school and be a teacher. I actually started working in group homes as a behavior specialist. And that's where my journey in education began. I started in the nonprofit world. And from there, I was encouraged to go into public education, which I did. And I became a paraprofessional. I said, let me just test the waters to see if this is what I wanted to do. And working with children, I loved it. Never had that thought, but had someone not encouraged me to do that, I probably never would have stepped into education. And then from there, I became a special education teacher.
Now, I wonder whether it's harder to manage students or members of Congress, but that's a subject of debate. So as an educator who taught in a group home, right, you saw firsthand the crisis of young men in our society.
Yes.
In cities like New York, there are hundreds of thousands of young men who don't necessarily go to school or go to work,
right,
whose only existence is life on the streets, and those young men are vulnerable to gang recruitment. So can you speak about your experience with the crisis of young men?
Yes. I mean, when you look at the numbers for the Bronx, in the South Bronx in particular, has the highest, when you think about poverty, right? One of the highest poverty index rates in the country. And across the entire New York State, 62 counties in New York, the Bronx has the highest rate of poverty across all 62 states and one of the most job-needy districts across the country. So we have to start thinking about what does that actually mean now for our children, right? If our parents are struggling, what is the impact and the likelihood of the experience that children are facing before they even come into school? And there's so much studies out there that shows the impact on when people grow up in poverty and what that does to them and any trauma that they have experienced. So now you have all of these things already before you even step into the school. So now think about the impact if I'm in a school and I have a teacher standing in front of me or any adult in that building who's standing in front of me who's never had that experience and may not understand, right? And so I just also want to clarify that just because I haven't had the experience doesn't mean that I can't be empathetic, doesn't mean that I haven't received any type of training to have an understanding of your experience. However, when we look at our education system, we don't have enough educators getting the training and the experience to understand the impact that our children who are coming in who are homeless, our children who are coming in who are abused, what that already means for them and how that impacts their learning in that space. And so this is why a lot of times you see a high rate of our boys in particular being recruited into gang activity. And why do they go to a gang? Like, no child aspires to that, but when we look at why, it's to have that sense of belonging. Right. And so as human beings, which we all need, and we're not put on earth to be in
we're
isolation.
Social creatures.
We're social creatures. So now if I'm in this space with a bunch of adults who don't understand me, and really and truly the way the system is designed, it's designed where they don't have time to understand me. Right? They're told that they have to teach by a certain curriculum, by a certain time. Everything is rung by the bell, right? And that's how we manage within those time constraints. And so you don't even know who I am. You have no idea what I'm dealing with before I even get here, right? And then you compound it with me then having to deal with things here that aren't in alignment to my needs. And so my needs are not being met. And that's what we find happening with a lot of our children across schools, and not just in the Bronx or in New York City, but all across this nation, which then ends up having a detrimental impact for many of our students. Obviously, everyone is different, but it ends up on a trajectory where, you know, a lot of our children go from school to prison.
You know, your words resonate with me on a personal level. When I was in high school, I had a severe struggle with depression, and I was chronically absent for a time.
Yeah.
And I was struck that no one in the school ever inquired about my well-being. It was almost as if I was a statistic that disappeared into the bureaucracy. I was amazed by the ease with which young kids could fall through the cracks. Is that your experience as an educator with the system?
Yes, that is exactly it. Our children lose their identity, right? And so we don't have a system that is designed to help them even discover who they are, right? How many children are coming in school even knowing who they are? That's not realistic to expect a child to come in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old knowing who they are, when we have many adults standing in front of them who don't know who they are.
Now, you're committed to lifting up our young people in the classroom, but you
Yes,
left the classroom.
I did.
So why?
I left the classroom because I started to see an overwhelming number of students, black and brown, mainly boys in particular, being referred for special education. So now, what does that mean? Let me clarify. Special education is not a place. Special education is a set of services. That's how it was originally designed, right? A set of services that are provided to children who are diagnosed with a qualified disability under the 13 disability classifications. Right. And so if a child receives that, right, they receive services, and it's supposed to be services until they don't need those services anymore. For example, let's say you got into an accident and required physical therapy, right? Students with special needs sometimes do get physical therapy, right? But you're not going to physical therapy every day for the rest of your life. That's what special education is also as well. It's services that are needed for a certain period of time until that student no longer needs it. What we've done in this country is that we've taken those services, and now special education is no longer a set of services, it's now become a placement. And many kids get that placement for their schooling life. Right? When you look at a lot of IEPs, and I found this even on my journey as a teacher, I get a student who's 10 years old, I look at the IEP from when they were 6 years old, and it still has the same goals 4 years later. That child is physically, you know, psychologically, emotionally different from when they were 6 years old, but yet we keep them boxed with these goals that don't help them to achieve and get to where they should be.
And are those students with special needs, in your view, are the most vulnerable to imprisonment?
Yes.
Now, I notice, I've heard the term school to prison pipeline, but you use the word preschool to prison pipeline. So why the insistence on preschool?
That's a great question. So the school to prison pipeline, when I say school to prison pipeline, and I ask people to visualize what comes to mind when they hear school to prison, oftentimes they visualize a child who's about 15, 16, 17 years old, right? The thing that people often say right after that, right, is, well, didn't these kids commit a crime? Shouldn't they go to jail? And that way they can learn their lesson. They should be punished, right? These kids have no respect these days. That's what I hear a lot of.
Well, there's
right?
an attempt to shift the blame from society to young people.
Exactly, right? And so it's all on the children should know better. These children need respect. And so people will try to justify incarcerating children because they believe that's a way of teaching children respect. Flip that now. I'm focused on preschool to prison because when you say preschool, what visual image do you get? Right? You're picturing a young
I think of innocence.
Innocence, right? Innocence.
Blamelessness.
Blamelessness. But also what you physically think of is not a tall 15, 16, 17. You're thinking of a child that's about this tall and you're like, wait, preschool to prison? It actually makes you stop and think. Right? And that's what I want people to do is not just brush it off as like, oh yeah, well, those kids did something. They belong in jail or prison, right? But then you have to stop and you say, wait, preschoolers are going to prison? Yeah, they are. And so that's the whole goal. And when we look at how the school system is designed and what's happening, we do have a trajectory in this country from preschool to prison. Now I have people will say, well, it's from the cradle to the prison, you know, and we can, it's all semantic, but I focus on preschool because we have kids that are coming in some places at 2.9 years old, right? And the expulsion rate is so high for kids in preschool right now, especially when you start looking at children with disabilities, and that's across racial lines. Black and brown children, it's disproportionately higher for them, but our children with disabilities, it even impacts children who are white. Right? And so we have this issue where we don't have enough training for educators for a number of reasons, right? Depends on where you're located. In some cities and states, they're getting an hourly pay. In some cities and states, people are making $15 an hour, right? And they say, I don't have time for this. I'm getting bitten. You know, I'm being attacked by a child. I didn't sign up for this. And so turnover is high, right? So we can't, even if we did get training, you're gone tomorrow, right? So there's so many layers to what's needed to, that's why I say dismantle the preschool to prison pipeline, because it's not only a disservice to children and their families, it's a disservice to the educators as well, and everybody's being set up to fail.
It's all of us.
It is all of us.
This is the future of our country.
I agree.
But it sounds like, so in the lowest income communities of color, you feel our young people, almost from the moment of birth, are being set up to fail.
Absolutely. So just to give you an idea, like when people want to think about numbers, Black children represent 15% of the U.S. population, right? Yeah. But they account for 41% of arrests. How, right, when you do the math on that, that's insane, right? By 2021, the children arrests, 7% of those arrests was for violent crimes. Just 7%. But yet we will focus on the 7% instead of the 93%. And when I talk about preschool to prison, I'm not even talking about crimes. Ritchie, I'm talking about children have been put out of school for crying too much. And I actually document that in the documentary, where children have been put out of school because of their hair. Children have been put out of school for using a cell phone. Things that are not threatening to anyone's life. These are the things that I'm focused on, because people will try to conflate the two and says, oh, well, you know, we have children coming in with guns and now we have school shooting. So these kids, they need to be taught a lesson. I'm not talking about that. We are misusing our resources when we call in a police officer to handle children who are crying. Right? When you think about, as a parent, no parent can ever fathom that I will drop my child off to school, my 3-year-old child, to get a call telling me, pick my child up from the police station. Because my child didn't sit down, they ran around the classroom. And these are the things that schools are calling the police for, right? When I speak to police officers, no police officer says they came into the field to arrest children. Right? It's a misuse of resources and an overutilization. And when that happens, there's a level of trauma there that gets built up. And trauma cannot be cured. right? It can only be treated.
Well, it's a ghost that haunts you for the rest of your life.
Absolutely, right? And what we don't
It's like
understand,
post-traumatic stress from a war zone.
exactly, and that's what a lot of educators coming in, they don't get that level of training in teacher prep schools. They have no idea. I haven't even experienced some of the things that our children are now experiencing. And what happens is once we put children in jail or prisons, the ones that are sent to adult prisons, because that's the other side to that a lot of people don't know, what's the impact once you have called the police? What is the long-term impact that you have now inflicted, not just on this child, but on their family, not just on the family, but on the community, is that now the likelihood of them committing suicide shoots up to 36%, right? So we have to really look at all angles of how we address this.
You know, I know from personal experience that something fundamental dies inside of you when you go to prison. I remember visiting a family member in prison when I was 15. He had been in prison for most of his adult life. And I asked him, you know, what are you going to do when you're no longer in prison? And he said, if I can't find a job, if I can't go to school, I'm just going to go back to the only life I've ever known.
Exactly.
And he said it with a sense of despair.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what our system produces, is hopelessness.
Intentionally, right? There's an intentionality. It's not rehabilitative. It should be. When you look at
it pretends to be rehabilitative.
It pretends to be.
We preach redemption, but we practice revenge. I mean, that's
exactly. To know that we only hold 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate more people than any other country. Right? Do you think about what happens when people come out? You start talking about reentry, right? And I also had a family member who went from school to prison, highly intelligent. They just didn't know what to do with him because he was so intelligent. And so he's left to his own vices in the classroom. And so we all know what happens when they're idle hands. And it's not that, you know, I'm not saying kids shouldn't take responsibility or people shouldn't take responsibility for their actions, but what are the things that led up to that? What is the antecedent that led up to the behavior? And that's what we don't talk about. We pay attention to the behavior. We don't address the antecedent to prevent the behavior from recurring. Right? So what we expect as a society is that we believe that once you send somebody to prison, that they will change, that you have corrected the behavior. But if they're not getting the resources, you think about when you're in there, I don't have any bills to pay, right? I don't have a job. I don't have to pay tax. I don't have to do anything. And then you open the doors one day and you say, all right, you're out of here, go back into society. And I've provided you no classes, no training, no home, no employment, no clothes. And what if I don't have a family? Where do I go? What do I do? So it becomes easy to recidivate. And this is why the recidivism rates is very high. Within 3 years, most people are likely to go back to prison after coming out.
You know, we as a society have to get serious about examining the social determinants of crime.
Yes.
And start addressing root causes. You know, we're all complicit.
I agree.
There are people who go into education with the best of intentions, but are unwittingly perpetuating the preschool to prison pipeline. So you're an educator for educators. Like, what are the strategies for breaking the preschool to prison pipeline in education?
There are a number of strategies that we can start to think about. And when you think about this, it has to come from multiple angles. It is not solely a teacher's responsibility to dismantle the preschool to prison pipeline. It is not solely placed on schools to dismantle the preschool to prison pipeline. It is not solely placed on parents to do that, right? We need everyone involved. And I tell people, even if you're not an educator, even if you're not a parent, you still have a role in dismantling the preschool to prison pipeline. Why? You are living, breathing, walking this earth every single day. And what people don't understand is, what kind of society will we have if we don't provide the resources and the support when our children are released, even if they are released as an adult, right? At some point, if all I knew was crime before I went in, and then I come out, you don't think I'm going to travel and be in your neighborhood at some point, right? And if that's where I end up going back to because that's what I know how to do, imagine if that's your mother, your loved one, your child walking the street now and becoming a victim of that. So I've had people say, well, I don't live in those neighborhoods. Oh yeah, because we know that crime only stays in that one neighborhood. Nobody travels, right?
Easily travels.
Exactly.
Borders. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's until you become a victim, you start thinking about how flawed this system is. And I've always said to people, the system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? And so now that's why we have to dismantle it, right? We can't just take pieces of it. We have to dismantle the whole thing and start over. Ritchie, and right now we have 47 states that allow corporal punishment in schools. Think about your
which goes against the best science.
Which goes against the best science, right? So now
it's a relic of the past.
Exactly, and they allow it in preschool.
Yeah, and so I'm sure it disproportionately affects people of color.
Always, and children with disabilities. So now go back to the visual of that 3-year-old. You send your 3-year-old to school to find out they're being hit. Yeah. Why is that the resort that we have, right?
It deepens the trauma.
It deepens the trauma. You know, back in 2023, I believe it was the month of October, Governor Hochul signed a bill banning corporal punishment, right? And so New York became the 3rd state to ban corporal punishment in schools. And to know, and when I talk to parents and I talk to educators, they're like, I didn't even know that that was a thing. I didn't even know that that was allowed. So number one is we do need some oversight. And when you start thinking about oversight, I'm thinking federally, then start thinking state and local, right? So federally, what needs to happen is we do need the Office of Civil Rights, the Office of Education to start paying attention to schools and districts that have a high referral rate for special education, a high suspension rate, a high expulsion rate. And start looking at, well, what are the plans that they're putting in place? Because school is supposed to be where I go to learn. School is supposed to be where I make mistakes. If I can't make mistake in school, then where else do I go? I have to go to prison to learn?
There's no alternative to education.
There's no alternative to education. And then if that child is of a certain age, once they hit 18, legally the prison system does not have to provide them an education, right? I've been to places where children are attending school in shackles, right? Like, what message are we sending them when we have children attending schools in shackles? So we need at the federal level have some oversight with that. In terms of having school districts and states provide some form of a plan of support on, so what is the reentry for kids, right? If you have this many suspensions, I'm the child and we have all these adults here, why are the numbers continuously going up when those numbers should be continuously going down? I'm in school to learn from you. You're the certified professional, right? So that's what we need to look at nationally. And when we start thinking on the state level, we also need to start thinking about getting a certification, a distinction. Every educator that goes into a teacher prep program should also leave duly certified in special education, right? It's not you just leave with a degree and now you're a math teacher. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've heard people say, I'm a math teacher. I'm an English teacher. No, you are an educator.
We put ourselves into these silos.
Exactly. Exactly.
When in fact, your teacher, your educator is often your second parent.
Exactly. The amount of time you're spending. So
you're dealing with students whose needs are not purely academic.
Exactly. So if we can get that special education distinction for every educator, right, coming in, number one, we start to narrow the shortage of special education teachers in this country, but also now they get a different level of training and awareness of what does it mean when a child has a disability. When you speak to people and you talk to them about people with special needs, that's another visual image people get. They think physical impairment. They always think that a person with a disability means that you're physically impaired. When no, I don't have to be physically impaired to have a disability. So this is also where cognitive dissonance happens for a lot of educators, because in their mind, you look like a physically able-bodied person. Why aren't you able to just sit for 7 straight hours a day?
Because your pain is hidden from public view.
Right. So imagine where we can start. So for me, I look at what's realistic and practical. And if you're coming into this field, we need to change what the training looks like when coming in, and that needs to be part of the certification process. And then, every year or 2 years, we need to have some retraining around trauma and social emotional learning and understanding what happened to an adolescent brain. Most educators are not getting training on adolescent development. They don't understand the teenage brain. Parents don't understand it. But then I hear that, well, parents are responsible. They should be doing all of this. Well, that's why they're sending their child to school. We have to provide the training for parents, right? And most parents, I'm working, and if I'm making an hourly wage, I don't even have the time to take off of work, because if I take off of work, I don't get paid, right? And then now if I don't get paid and I can't feed my children, now you're going to call Child Protective Services on me. I can't win as a parent. So
it's a lose-lose.
It's a lose-lose. So schools cannot just be a building in a community, right? We can't, schools actually have to be a community school.
With a hub of services.
Yes, with a hub of services. You're not a school in a community, you need to be a community school. And that's what we're missing right now, where we don't have wraparound services. You're not just educating the child. You know, in every school district we serve students and families. And then I say, so what are you providing the families? Oh, we don't have time for that. And they say, but this is on your mission. This is part of your vision statement. Yeah. What do you mean we don't have services, we don't have training, we don't, right? And I keep hearing all the things we don't have.
Endless excuse making, yeah.
Endless, right? And a lot of it is valid through the sense of funding, right? A lot of that is valid in the sense of, I work this time to that time. So who do we have available, right? And this is where we come back to the federal government on relying on funding. Education is consistently cut, right? We've had over 6,000 jails and prisons in this country, but only 3,900 colleges. So why do we have more jails
and our young
than
men
colleges?
Are overrepresented in prison.
Absolutely.
And underrepresented in college education.
Yes. Ritchie, do you know the percentage, when you look at this research, 70% of people who are incarcerated did not graduate school. Yeah. Strong correlation of preschool to prison, school to prison. That if I don't have an education, right, the likelihood may not be in my favor. Yeah, so this is where, for me, you know, we have organizations that focus on supporting people that are incarcerated and help support them when they get out, and that's the reentry. But for me, it's how are we helping to prevent it in the first place? And that's the antecedent that I keep talking about. Right? Like, why aren't we going back to the beginning so that we can start reducing that pipeline? We shouldn't be waiting for the aftermath to provide resources and support, because now that trauma is already there. But how do we prevent it on the front end? How do we get parents what they need? How do you think about mothers who are living in poverty, right? And they don't have enough food and resources. Think about the impact to that child before the child's even born. So there's so many layers to this, you know, when people ask, and it's not cut and dry of, well, if we do this, it disappears and whoop, pipeline's done.
There are no magic bullets.
There are no magic bullets, but these are tangible solutions. The ones that I'm talking about, these are tangible solutions that we can start to talk about and start putting in place, where we can change the training that we're providing from the onset, work with universities and teacher prep programs, where understanding adolescent development, the teenage brain, understanding trauma, understanding the impact of social emotional learning, that has to be part of teacher prep and leadership prep programs if we truly care about the future of our children and about the future of this country. This country spends over $80 billion incarcerating people annually, right? And in most places, we have teachers only making $40,000 a year.
Look, we have the resources to end the preschool to prison pipeline.
We do.
What we need is the political will.
We do.
So thank you for telling your story and living your truth and changing the lives of the most vulnerable people in our public school system. You're doing God's work.
Thank you. I am.
It's
Thank
such a
you
pleasure.
so much. I appreciate that.
You.
Thank you for having me.